Last time, we told you the story of Eleanor Dare, a young Englishwoman who crossed an ocean while pregnant, who gave birth to the first English child ever born in America, who watched her father sail away promising to return quickly, and who then disappeared, along with 114 other colonists, into the American wilderness. We told you about John White's return in 1590, 3 years too late, finding nothing but an empty fort and one word carved into a wooden post, Croton, a word that has haunted American history for 435 years. We ended that episode by telling you about something extraordinary, something that transformed this from a simple historical mystery into one of the strangest and most contested controversies in American archaeology. A stone, found in 1937, 350 years after Eleanor Dare vanished, a stone that some believed carried her actual words, her final message to a father who never came back in time. This is episode 2. This is the story of that stone, and the 47 others that followed it, and the question that has divided historians for nearly a century. Was this the greatest archaeological discovery in American history, or one of the most elaborate hoaxes ever perpetrated on the American public? I am going to tell you exactly what happened, exactly what the stone said, exactly who was involved, and exactly why, even today, with modern science and forensic analysis available to us, nobody can say with complete certainty which one is true. The story begins in the autumn of 1937. A man named Lewis Hammond, a tourist from California, walked into the history department at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. He was carrying a stone, a heavy piece of quartz, weighing approximately 21 pounds, covered in what appeared to be deliberate carved markings. Hammond told the professors a specific story. He said that he and his wife had been out collecting hickory nuts along the Chowan River near Edenton, North Carolina, on a newly opened stretch of highway, and that he had stumbled across the stone in the woods, roughly a quarter-mile from the riverbank. He said the carvings had caught his attention, that he could not fully read them, and that he had brought the stone hoping someone at the university could help him understand what it said. This timing matters enormously to understanding what happened next. 1937 was not a random year. It was the 350th anniversary of Virginia Dare's birth. The lost colony of Roanoke was experiencing a massive surge in public interest. A theatrical production about the colony was being staged near the actual historical site. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself was scheduled to visit North Carolina to mark the anniversary. The entire country was thinking about Roanoke in a way it had not thought about the mystery in generations. And into this moment of heightened attention, a stone appeared, claiming to answer the question that had haunted America for 3.5 centuries. The professors at Emory examined the stone carefully. They applied flour to the carved surfaces to make the faint markings more visible against the dark quartz. And what they found stunned them. The inscription on the stone, once fully deciphered, read as a message, written in archaic English, the style and spelling consistent with 16th century writing conventions. It described death, Ananias Dare, Eleanor's husband, dead. Virginia, Eleanor's daughter, the first English child born in America, dead. The stone was signed with 3 initials, EWD, Eleanor White Dare. I want you to sit with the weight of what this claimed to be, not a historical document written by a scholar centuries later, speculating about what might have happened. A first-hand account, written, according to its claim, by Eleanor Dare herself, in the immediate aftermath of losing her husband and her infant daughter, a grieving mother, carving her grief into stone because she had no other way to send word to the father she desperately hoped would somehow still find it. If this stone was genuine, it was not simply an archaeological artifact. It was the actual voice of a woman who had been lost to history for 350 years, speaking directly, across the centuries, about the worst thing that had ever happened to her. A history professor named Haywood Pierce Jr. became deeply convinced the stone was authentic. He was excited, genuinely, professionally excited, in the way that a scholar becomes excited when they believe they may be looking at something that could rewrite an entire chapter of history. He convinced his father, Haywood Pierce Sr., who was president of a small college in Gainesville, Georgia called Roanoke College, to purchase the stone from Hammond. The purchase was made, and the stone found a permanent home at an institution that would become inseparably linked, for better or worse, with its fate. Once the first stone was purchased and publicized, something happened that should immediately raise questions for anyone examining this mystery. More stones began appearing, dozens of them. A stonecutter from Fulton County, Georgia named William Eberhart came forward in the summer of 1939, claiming to have found a second stone. This one, he said, was engraved with the names of 17 deceased English colonists. The Pierces, eager to authenticate their original discovery, had actually offered a public reward, $500, for anyone who could locate a second Dare stone that might confirm the details described in the first. Eberhart claimed his reward, and then he kept finding more and more. Between 1937 and 1941, a total of 48 inscribed stones surfaced, found across North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Each one added to the narrative, told more of the story, described the colonists' desperate journey inland after John White departed, their conflicts with local native tribes, their dwindling numbers as illness and violence claimed more and more of them. According to the full narrative these stones together told, the colonists had migrated nearly 500 miles from Roanoke Island, southwestward, all the way to the Chattahoochee River, near what is today the city of Atlanta, Georgia, nearly 500 miles, through wilderness that had no roads, no established paths, populated by native peoples whose relationship with English colonists ranged from cautious cooperation to open hostility. The stones described a group of desperate survivors, reduced eventually to a mere 24 people, moving deeper and deeper into unfamiliar territory. Then, according to one stone, they spotted a ship. Hope must have surged through whatever remained of that group. And then, the stone claims the native people who had been traveling with them turned against them. An attack, killing all but 7 of the remaining 24, including, the stones claim, Ananias Dare and Virginia Dare. The 7 survivors, according to the inscription, buried their dead, carved a memorial in stone, and recorded their tragedy, hoping that somehow, someday, the message would reach Governor John White. This was the story that 48 stones, taken together, told, a complete narrative, a tragic ending to America's oldest mystery. If it was true, I want to walk you through why this story began to unravel, because the collapse of the Dare stone's credibility is almost as important as the initial discovery. The first serious crack appeared with Lewis Hammond himself. After turning the stone over to the scholars at Emory, Hammond disappeared completely. Investigators and journalists who later tried to track him down to learn more about who he was, what his background was, whether his story about finding the stone held up to scrutiny, could not locate him. A man who had made one of the most significant claimed discoveries in American archaeological history simply vanished from the historical record himself. This alone should have raised immediate red flags. But there was something more damaging still coming. A journalist named Boyden Sparks, working for the Saturday Evening Post, began investigating the stones with a skeptical eye. He tracked down William Eberhart, the stonecutter who had found dozens of the subsequent stones. And Eberhart, under pressure, confessed. He admitted that he had fabricated at least some of the stones himself. There were allegations, reported at the time, that Eberhart had attempted to blackmail the Pierces, using threats related to the authenticity of the stones as leverage. Sparks published his exposé, and it devastated the credibility of the entire collection. The narrative in the press shifted almost overnight, from wonder and excitement about a groundbreaking historical discovery to public embarrassment for the scholars and the institution that had championed the stones. Greenock College, which had built part of its public reputation around housing these artifacts, found itself associated instead with what many now considered one of the great hoaxes of the era. Most of the 48 stones are, today, considered fraudulent by the majority of historians. Eberhardt's confession, combined with Sparks's investigative reporting, essentially discredited the entire collection, except for one stone, the very first one, the one Lewis Hammond brought to Emory in 1937, before the reward money, before Eberhardt entered the picture, before the pressure to find more stones created an obvious financial incentive for fabrication. That first stone, the Chowan River stone, has never been definitively debunked, and that single fact is what has kept this mystery alive for nearly 90 years. I want to tell you what makes the first stone different, what has kept serious historians, even skeptical ones, unwilling to completely dismiss it. The linguistic analysis is genuinely puzzling. Scholars who have examined the inscription have found that its spelling patterns, its archaic phrasing, its syntax, are consistent with authentic 16th century English usage, the kind of writing patterns you would expect from an educated Englishwoman of that specific era. This is significant because creating a convincing forgery of period-accurate 16th century English is genuinely difficult. It requires specialized knowledge that was not widely available or easily researchable in 1937. Long before the internet, before easily searchable historical archives, before the kind of detailed linguistic resources that exist today, would a random tourist or an opportunistic stonecutter looking for reward money have had access to the kind of specialized knowledge needed to convincingly replicate Elizabethan-era written English? It seems unlikely. There is also the physical evidence, petrographic analysis, the scientific examination of the stone's mineral composition and the weathering patterns on its carved surfaces, has found that the geological evidence is consistent with the inscription being genuinely old, consistent with centuries of exposure, not with fresh, recent carving. In 2009, a historian named David LaVere at the University of North Carolina Wilmington conducted a serious academic reevaluation of the Chowan River stone. His conclusion, published in the North Carolina Historical Review, leaned toward supporting the stone's authenticity. He noted that the narrative told on the stone was credible, that it coincided reasonably well with the limited historical sources that do exist about the lost colony. There are, admittedly, some details that create doubt. Experts in medieval and Renaissance-era graffiti and inscription have noted that certain abbreviations used on the stone, such as the shortened form of Virginia's name, do not have clear precedent from that specific era. A Shakespeare scholar who examined Eleanor's supposed signature noted that the specific three-initial format used was somewhat unusual for the period, but these are relatively minor points of doubt, not conclusive proof of forgery. The honest scholarly position held by many serious researchers today is this: the Chowan River stone cannot be proven fraudulent, and it cannot be proven genuine. It exists in a state of permanent, frustrating uncertainty, which means that somewhere, quite possibly, carved into a piece of quartz that has sat in a university collection for nearly 90 years, is the actual voice of Eleanor Dare, describing, in her own hand, the death of her husband and her infant daughter, or it is an extraordinarily sophisticated forgery, created by someone with knowledge and skill that seems almost implausible for the era in which it appeared, and we do not know which. I want to end this episode by asking a question that I think matters more than the simple authentic or fake debate that has consumed most discussions of the Dare stones. If the first stone is genuine, what does that mean for how we understand what happened to the lost colony? The narrative the stones describe is devastating. A 500-mile journey through unfamiliar wilderness, conflict and cooperation with native peoples that shifted, tragically, into violence. A slow reduction in numbers through illness, hardship, and eventually, according to the stones, a final massacre. Ananias Dare, dead. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, dead as an infant or very young child. Eleanor Dare herself, surviving long enough to carve her grief into stone. But her ultimate fate after that point is left unrecorded. This is a profoundly different narrative than the more commonly accepted theory, that the colonists relocated peacefully to Croton Island and were gradually absorbed into the Croton tribe, living out relatively normal, if transformed, lives among a welcoming native community. The stones, if genuine, tell us something much darker, that the word Croton carved into that palisade post may not have represented a peaceful, planned relocation at all, that it may have been the beginning of a desperate, prolonged struggle for survival that ultimately failed for most of the colonists, that Eleanor Dare did not simply vanish into a new life among the Croton people, but instead endured years of hardship, loss, and grief before finally, somewhere far from Roanoke Island, carving her testimony into a stone and hoping against hope that it would somehow find its way to her father. I do not know which version of history is correct. Nobody does. But I think it matters that we sit with both possibilities, not just as an intellectual puzzle to be solved, but as a question about real human suffering. Because whichever story is true, a young mother lost her husband, lost her infant daughter, or was lost herself, along with everyone she had crossed an ocean with, and 435 years later, we are still trying to understand what happened to her. This is episode 2 of the Roanoke Cipher. In our next episode, we will examine the strongest evidence for and against the stone's authenticity, the forensic techniques modern science has applied to this centuries-old mystery, and we will ask whether it is even possible, after all this time, to know the truth. That is a story for episode 3. Subscribe to Grey Archive Tales, and come back. We will be waiting the way that stone has waited in a glass case at a small college in Georgia for someone someday to finally prove what it truly is.